Hey everybody, I'm Matt Davis, artist and playwright, and I have the honor of interviewing Ashley Mack-Jackson, the commissioned poet for the Etheridge Knight mural as a part of the Bicentennial Legends mural project. Super excited to be here. Ashley, thank you so much for this.
This is an honor. So excited to talk to you.
And thank you so much for the poem too. I can't say enough about it. We're gonna get all into it. I've been nerding out since I heard it, and I've heard you perform it too. And it was overwhelming. It's a tremendous piece. So I'm excited to be here. So let's get right into it. You know, how'd you get started writing? Like, what got you going?
Well, I feel like reading and writing have always been super therapeutic for me. It's probably around middle school when I really started to, take writing seriously, just in that, I didn't think anything would happen with my writing, but just in that I would do it almost daily. I have a really close friend, Rashida Green, who she transferred into my middle school, when we were in 7th grade, and she was an avid reader and writer, and so we would start to write back and forth to each other. Started with notes, then stories, but then we would trade poems and ideas and thoughts, and just the writing really grew our relationship, but also just helped me to filter through all whatever the stuff is that you're going through when you're 12, 13 years old. And that's just a practice that I took with me for a long time. And then when I went to college and I took my first creative writing workshop, that's when I really realized that a writer was who I really was. Not just something that I did, but really something that was part of even how I process and think about life. Without writing, I don't really know how to think through many things. So writing slows me down to do that. And so I've been writing for a long time, but probably formally for now, it's crazy to say, probably about 20 years. But awesome. That's my process and how I kind of came to writing as a craft and as my main art form.
Excellent. Yeah, no. Etheridge talks about sometimes how he doesn't trust a poet if they don't talk about their personal life, their friends, their family. And anytime I've heard your work, and I've heard you a few times now, I always hear you. I can clearly hear you. And just what you just said there is it's become a part of who you are. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, just who Ashley is.
I am native Hoosier, very, very proud Hoosier. It took me going away from Indiana to realize how proud I was to be a Hoosier and a Midwesterner. Grew up right here in Indianapolis, went to schools in Washington Township. So I'm a product of public schools right here in the area. And so I grew up here, grew up with my parents. Had somewhat of a complicated history. And again, that's some of what comes up and has come up in my writing, especially my history with my dad. He was incarcerated when I was young. Right. And so in and out of prison. And so writing also became a tool for us to communicate with each other. Wow. Back and forth. And he was also a writer. And so sometimes I know that I leaned into impressing him, even since he's passed on years ago, but even still leaning into that conversation with him, being a writer. And so that's a bit of my background. Went to school in Washington, D.C., actually came back here and graduated from IUPUI, then went to Ball State, taught at Ivy Tech for 7 years, and now I'm teaching at Butler. So I really say all that to say that Indianapolis is just inside of me. Yeah. And in ways I've tried to run away from that in my younger years, but I think about how not only our parents, our family, but where we're from, it really encodes in who we are. Mm-hmm. And trying to run away from that was never really successful for me. And leaning into that though has been an awakening for me personally, but I think also artistically, to not think of Indianapolis as a place where nothing is going on creatively. I see so much going on creatively and historically, even Indianapolis, Indiana, the Midwest. And so reclaiming that within myself has been a big part of my work. Wow.
Yeah. No, it's funny you brought that up about your father. I heard you actually at the Etheridge Knight celebration in April, where you were announced as a commissioned poet, and you talking about your background and your family. And that is just amazing, the way you're able to carry that type of vulnerability. I'm going to get more into that later. But first, can you talk a little bit more Now you're this terrific, tremendous writer who's educating the next generation of writers and all that in the city. But who are your influences though? Like, who helped you get here? So obviously Etheridge and others, but is it? I see a lot there. Who all is in?
So I mean, I could go on. I don't want to start here because I could go on and on and on forever about this.
The highlights.
But let's some highlights for me. Like the first poet that I really think I ever became truly obsessed with was Rita Dove. She's a poet laureate when I was young, and so having a Black woman as poet laureate,
right?
And so leaning into her, shout out to Rita Dove, leaning into her work and the way that she like dealt with the themes of adolescence and family. That's something that I started to do. In terms of form and in terms of like energy in my work, I think reading Lucille Clifton had just again now just opened my mind into a way. A friend once described her poems like a bouquet of flowers with a hand grenade inside, and that's like I would always want that energy. Like this is a beautiful thing, and then it's just gonna blow up something for you. A lot of times when I read too, and when I'm asked to read or especially perform more than just like reading, I'll start with the Lucille Clifton, Won't You Celebrate with Me, because it just is the energy that I want to have, that like every day something has tried to kill all of us and has failed. And so that juxtaposition of like the beauty and joy of life with just all of the hardship that comes along with surviving, with living, is something that I've always tried to put into my work. I could go on and on, but bell hooks as a scholar, definitely Alice Walker, Toni Morrison.
The classics.
Leaning into, those Black women writers who really shaped my life and then also gave me permission to feel like my story was valid, that there are people and audiences who want and need to hear from a person like me. Those were the folks who were doing that work when I was coming up. And so they've always been huge inspirations for me.
Wow, that was profound. And speaking of how you came up and you kind of helping to train up that next generation, I mean, right now we're in the Chatterbox. And this is where Etheridge Knight used to do the Free People's Workshop.
Yeah.
And so this is where he was helping other people find their voice and find their pen and find themselves, And you do a lot of that as well. Not only as like this, renowned professor and writer now, but also you're a part of a youth program where you're doing direct, teaching and guidance and mentorship and facilitation of other people's development in the craft. Tell us a little bit about Word is Bond and that relationship.
So Word is Bond is an organization that I mentioned Rashida Green earlier, one of my best friends and one of my biggest inspirations as a writer. She's a very, very quiet woman, but a dynamic writer. Like, talk about heart and soul and vulnerability in writing. She's taught me so many things about that. But about 10 years ago, we got together, or actually it was before that, we got together and really started talking about what writing has meant to us and what we would love to see for others and just the opportunities explored. At that time, she saw the documentary, Brave New Voices documentary that was done on HBO. And she was thinking about like all the opportunities that we hadn't had as young creatives and writers. We just never, now kids are taking creative writing class in middle school, like regularly. I hear this, but that was not something that we grew up with. Everything that had to do with like taking a creative writing class was far outside of our reach in terms of how expensive it was or what community it was housed in that maybe have been far or felt far from our reach. And so we talked about like what we wanted to do. The reason the organization is called Word as Bond is because we wanted to bring young people from all over Central Indiana together to write, to share their stories, to have an authentic experience, not only like developing in their craft, but also developing with each other. For me, I'm a teacher. Like, I can talk about writing all day, but I also can talk about teaching. Teaching, like writing, is something that is in me. Like, I learn and understand through teaching and through exchanging with students in the way that I learn and understand through writing. And so my teaching and writing, they really feed each other. And if one is not there and strongly supported, the other doesn't feel as supported. teaching is not something that I do because I don't feel like successful as a writer, or vice versa. Like, I don't write because I feel like, I'm not that great of a teacher. It's really honestly something that works together. And so Word is Bond was a natural for us to think about like how we could serve our community. We have intentionally always kept our programs free. We've taken teams of youth to Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Slam, which is an international youth poetry festival and competition that happens each year somewhere in the United States. Students have gone places like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, San Francisco, like all over. And we do all of this through donors, through grants, through just really the work of the two of us together, to make sure that they have these experiences. It's really exciting because one of our students, Alyssa Gaines, she's the outgoing National Youth Poet Laureate, and she competed on teams with us for, I want to say 4 or 5 years. She started when she was 13, so the very age of eligibility on up. And we cannot take credit for all of the amazing work that she's done, but to be a part of that community and for other youth to see, like, this is where you can go with your words. It's just such a joy and the work that you do. And it feeds my, like, I can't say that this is completely like altruistic because it feeds my work. They teach me something every single time. And I'm always like, the students have surpassed the teacher because the things that they bring in, the perspectives, on what's going on, it's such a delight to have them and those students and that organizational work in my life. It's brought me so many opportunities, as well as hopefully the students that we've served.
Absolutely, and it shows too. To switch gears a little bit, so can we talk about a little bit about Etheridge's impact, right? So definitely his work, and he's prolific and all that, but like his legacy is complicated too, right? And so what does his legacy mean for you and your work? Like, he's a really complex legend, there's obviously a lot of bicentennial legends out there, but this is a very complex cultural figure, not just writer, but cultural figure too, for the time. And then he's got this timelessness about him. So what does his legacy mean for you and your craft too?
I think, so we talked about influences earlier, and I didn't mention Etheridge Knight just because I knew it was obvious. We would get to it.
I'm sure you heard
because I could talk about this for a while. Right. But Etheridge Knight was the first poet. I didn't get introduced to his work when I was young here in Indianapolis, which I feel like is a shame, James Whitcomb Riley. That was the poet from Indiana. And I was excited about that because they said like he was the Beyonce of his time or whatever. Like people would come out.
That's how I've always seen him as Beyonce. That's
Beyonce,
how
James Whitcomb Riley, Beyonce, right?
Normally
how you picture them together. So that's what, that's how it was described to me like some time ago. That he was like super famous guy. And so I, was interested in his work and like that, but I never heard Mari Evans, Etheridge Knight and those folks who were working right here and even more contemporary, even like, at the time when I was young, Mari Evans was still writing and working and living, here in the city. And so I, never heard about his work until I went off to college. I went to Howard University, and one of my dear professors and greatest mentors, Tony Medina, I was in his creative writing course, and he calls himself a child of the Black arts movement. He's not in that era, but like a little bit younger, and was raised up by a lot of those guys. And so he introduced his work in class, and reading, the first thing was the idea of ancestry, and reading that poem was the first time like I felt emerge in my poetic voice. Like others, I felt influenced and like aspirational. I wanted to be like them. Something about Etheridge Knight's work felt like I was like him. And so when you talk about the idea of complex legacy, I think that if we're honest about any legend, if we're honest about any human being and honest about human experience in the way that he is in his work, all of us are extremely complex. And are we allowing ourselves to be that in like academic spaces, poetry on pages, the kinds of things we invite into anthologies, right? Is it allowed to be as complex as we as human beings are? It's not always the case, right? But I think that certainly his work, just that. And then so I started to dig deep. The next poem was like his love poems, and like the level of sometimes anger that he can express right there with tenderness. It's how I felt. I don't know how like a 19-year-old kid, was feeling those same things, but like, the anger right next to the tenderness. Even him writing about his experiences in prison, having a parent who had been incarcerated, those were often my feelings. Like, I'm really angry at you for being incarcerated, but I also feel this closeness and this tenderness towards you and this need for your love and care, and this just love for you and connection to you. And so he was doing that work masterfully. And so since then, he's been one of my greatest, like, never met him in person, but one of my greatest guides in life, because his work really does that. It brings all of the human experience together. Wow,
thank you so much for sharing that. That was really powerful. Another thing about Etheridge is he almost felt responsible to not only share his truths, his more introspective pieces, like you talk about the introspective, interpersonal aspect to his work. I think that always stands out. But another thing that is super clear in all of his, it's a constant, is he almost has this responsibility to speak to the times. Poems from Prison comes out in 1968. I mean, he's literally behind the wall in 1968. I mean, this is one of the most revolutionary years in American history, world history, early 70s belly song, Born of a Woman. Like, even when he's publishing the work, it's in these like really poignant times, these really critical times of change. And so how does that play into your work? Not just social commentary, but, do you feel responsible to speak to the times in a similar fashion? Or?
I think that in a way, I feel responsible to myself, therefore responsible to speak to the times that I live in. And I think that that's a lot, again, of what Etheridge Knight's work did. And I think that what is exciting about it and what makes it celebrated in so many, now, coming to be celebrated in so many different circles, is that the responsibility seemed to be, to me, to the self first, and to be honest about who I am and my experience and what I'm going through, what I'm seeing in life. If he's writing about someone who is brutally assaulted in prison, right? A young person this is not just a made-up experience that he's gathering from someone else, or it's not just political commentary for the sake of clout, because there's power in speaking about certain issues, especially for historically marginalized folks. There can be a way to, I say maybe a sense of self-exploitation, right? To speak to certain things out of a need to, one, be heard, out of a...
Because it's a Black poem.
Exactly. So out of an idea that you're pushed into a certain lane, right? That you're pushed into certain identities. And this is the only sphere that you're allowed to speak on.
Black
so you
poets
have
write
to,
Black poems.
Exactly. So you must, always speak at this time. And on this subject matter. And he pushed against that by always leaning into the self and the experience, and even philosophically, the way that he saw the world. And so that is something that and it always is political. For me, the personal, I'm a Black woman, I'm a queer woman, as like living as who I am. Like, it's always political, right? Just like it's been politicized. I didn't make it this way, right? The political nature of our beings is something that is put upon all of us, before we have a chance to. And I think that that's something that Etheridge Knight truly understood and leaned into in his work. Again, writing a love poem is a commentary, becomes a commentary, because it is in our minds, it's wrapped up, becomes a commentary on love and relationships, becomes a commentary on patriarchy, becomes a commentary on religion, right? Because he is allowing in his work all of those things to enter. He's saying, all enter here, right? And trying to express that fully. And so I think that in that way, my work is inherently political. And sometimes there are moments where I choose to speak on a specific topic, but I really try to always work that through what I know and my experience, and not just playing to a particular crowd at a moment, because those moments are fleeting, and there are times when they'll love you and then they won't. And so I have to always be playing to what is really truly important to me, and immediate in my life at the time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Can we talk about the style of this poem? I've just been admiring it since I read it, since I've heard you perform it as well. Just the way you broke it down. I mean, you talked about the Black arts movement, and stylistically, like the way that things were written, the way that things were performed back then, it's very different. And the way you wrote this in honor of him, as an homage to him, has some of that feel, especially that first part. The fact that you broke it into 2 parts gives it a classic feel. And then the way you use the forward slash, it just gives it a different rhythm. But then when you deliver it, it's got this kind of contemporary spoken word feel to it. I could go on and on and on. And then the second half kind of has this storytelling, prosy feel, the way it carries. Can you talk about the way you formatted this? And everybody should read this poem. Everybody should read this poem. Everybody should hear this poem, not just the interview. You need this poem.
Well, thank you so much.
No, they need the poem. So, can you talk to us about the format?
Well, honestly,
however much you want to say about it.
It's just, a lot of what I did when I was writing this poem, I went and dug into the archives that they have at Butler, and just a chance to just kind of like sit with Etheridge Knight, with his work, and kind of look at his handwriting, look at like even the ways that his handwriting changed over time during illness and things like that. Just was really important to me to almost ask permission. Really big on like ancestors, and like
Absolutely.
I feel like Etheridge Knight is one of mine, like
Absolutely.
that's at my back.
Absolutely.
And so
Sure.
I wanted to sit there and like ask permission to like use this story to be part of what this bigger thing is. And so that was the first thing, and just really diving back into a lot of his poetry and his work. And the thing that that always came to me is that it's equally form and function. We talk about the idea of like a political message and what we want to say. And anytime you're asked to do a poem for a reason, for an occasion, right, it automatically gets like stamped and covered with a sort of kind of message. But one thing that Etheridge Knight never did in his work is let the idea of what the message was supposed to be take over the craft and the heart and the vulnerability of that message. And so that's really where I wanted to lean into. Also, when I was just looking at the work, I really thought about Etheridge Knight as a formal poet, and the ways that he uses form and rhyme and meter, right, to get that across. But again, willing to break that if the need of the poem is to break that. And so when I came to the first part of the poem, which is very formally tight, lines of 7 words, tightly seven line stanzas, lines of 7 words, Kwansaba, also referencing like that Black arts movement. But in that way, it kind of pushes against it, because this is a poem that in its form really is celebrating the Black arts movement, but it's not like the typical kind of form, because it's more lyrical.
Exactly.
In that part. It's not the typical kind of form that's associated with it. So in that part, I felt like inside of me, like there was this thing from Mr. Knight that was saying like, let's show off that we know how to write a poem, right? Like we know how to write a poem. We know how to do some images, like, because a lot of times when folks talk about Etheridge Knight, we get stuck on like, oh, this person was in prison. Isn't this amazing that someone in prison has a brain, And he was like, no, I'm a poet, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's what that whole part was about. Partially, and even the political message in there is like, I'm a poet, right? Like I know how to make a line and break a line and to rhyme and to slash here and there. And then the second part was really me listening, right? So I felt like the first part was like really a joint effort. Like, let's use some of the imagery and the ideas that from Etheridge Knight's life and the things that come up about him, the things about leaving home, things about being in prison and having poetry and the word be the center of his life. Let's show that off in the first part. But then in the second part, let's just listen to what Etheridge Knight has to say to us. And I think that I hope, like me, you talk about the personal in the poetry. Another way that I entered this poem is like, how can I see myself in this story? And I think another way is that you talked about the Free People's workshops that he did not only here in Indianapolis, but in different places, wherever he was in the country, he was teaching. And so something about that shows me, like, when you're teaching and teaching folks for free and teaching folks in coffee shops and colleges and bars, that lets me know that, like, teaching is like, you're compelled, right? Like, you're called. You're not just like, nobody just teaches. Well, some people do, but if you're really not teaching for the paycheck and nobody's making you teach, you're already getting a paycheck to just show up and read some poems. You're just an instructor at that point. But you are compelled to teach the folks. That told me that, like, he would want to teach us. Like, he would want to have part of this poem be about, like, what he can share, what his life experience can share with us, but also, like, creatively, what might I be able to share? And so I hope that with the second part of the poem, which is just more narrative and more straightforward about, like, his life experiences and what he might want to show off, I hope that that's what it shows, like, him as the teacher, him as the leader, and that it was more than just about, like, being a poet and being celebrated as that, but also about sharing it, that there was no poetry. He said that, like, without speaking it out loud, without sharing it with people, like, this is meaningless. And so I hope that is what showed in the second part.
Oh, it conveyed. Trust me, it landed. And also you could tell you had a clear sense of audience and purpose with it, as someone who is a playwright, who's, writing a play about his life. Shouts out to Hanako Gavia as well. And the whole Knight family, and they will appreciate this piece. Folks like myself and other people who are committed to his work and legacy and all that, I know all of them well too. And that's really hard to do. He talks about how in poems like A Poem for Myself or Idea of Ancestry, sorry about that, how, poets write about, what they know, you know what I mean? And you did an incredible job, especially in that second half, of almost like writing in his voice, you know what I mean? But yet keeping it third person, that is very hard to do. And so I just wanted to touch on that. And then lastly, just to end on a note, what do you want the takeaway to be? Like, when people read this poem, when they see the mural, and when they read the poem or hear the poem, what do you want them to walk away with?
I really hope, like, I try to draw the poem, like, in a cyclical way, like bringing us back to the idea of a circle. Just even thinking about, like, the idea of ancestry is where I started with this work. And honestly, when I started writing this poem, I wanted to write against that. I wanted to, like, find anything else that wasn't that. And it kept calling me back, because this is really a mural, Legends project. This really is about ancestry and legacy. And so when I thought about, like, the title, The Architecture of Eternity, like that, like, our ancestors, those who are before us, are also always still with us, right? And so I think that my hope is that whatever this poem does, whatever the mural does, is that it drives people back to him, and that, like, keeps him alive. But I think that, like, that's really what he wanted, again, for him to be of the people and within the people at the same time. And so I hope that, like, the biggest praise would be that someone would read this poem and immediately go find some work by Etheridge Knight. And so that is, like, my ultimate goals. I guess someone said, I read your poem and I read everything. Now I read everything that Etheridge Knight ever wrote. Exactly.
Well, mission accomplished. Mission accomplished. It is certainly inspiring. And I just want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your work, and thank you for your commitment to poetry and to Indianapolis. And thanks everybody for tuning in. Special thanks to David at the Chatterbox for letting us have this beautiful facility to do this interview in. This is a legendary space for Etheridge Knight and people who are his fans. Also, big thanks to Indiana Humanities and the Arts Council. Ashley, thank you so much again.
Thank you, Matt.
Appreciate you.